We are here with my dear friend, Dr. Louise Swerling. Dr. Swerling is a national authority on the topic of reading and reading disabilities, and she authors many articles and the following books: The Structured Literacy Planner, Designing Interventions for Common Reading Difficulties, Grades 1 through 9, Off Track, When Poor Readers Become Learning Disabled, Structured Literacy Interventions, Teaching Students with Reading Difficulties, Grades K through 6, The Power of RTI and Reading Profiles, a Blueprint for Solving Reading Problems. Dr. Swerling is here to answer questions about literacy and especially teaching reading and the best evidence-based practices. So let's start by you telling us about your background in reading.
Okay, so my background was that when I was first starting out in my career, I taught as a learning disabilities teacher in a public school at the elementary level. And then I had a chance to teach at the college level. That was something that in those days you could get hired without a PhD at the college level. But if you got hired, if you wanted to stay, you would have to get the PhD. So I liked college teaching, and I ended up getting my PhD in cognitive psychology, which was a really good choice. It was just pure luck on my part that there were all these findings coming out in cognitive psychology at the time that were very relevant to reading. So a lot of the initial work on phonemic awareness was done by cognitive psychologists. A lot of the work on, reading comprehension strategies was done by cognitive psychologists. So, and I think it gave me a broader perspective on students' learning problems and how to help them. So that was very valuable. And then I started doing some of my own research. My main focus in my own research has been poor reader profiles, different types of reading difficulties, both disabilities like dyslexia, but also difficulties that are more experientially based, like you might see in most, English learners. And also on teachers' knowledge base for teaching reading. And that was kind of probably the research that got me known in the research community, because a lot of people were not doing it yet. So that was kind of an advantage. But the main professional hat I wore for many, many years was being a teacher educator. And I worked at Southern for almost 4 decades, training general and special educators to teach reading using what we would now call structured literacy methods. At the time, the term structured literacy had not been coined, but I trained teachers the way I was trained, and I was very lucky that I got great. My own teacher preparation was really good and focused on explicit, systematic teaching methods. Reading research now, I would say, is really multidisciplinary. So a lot of research has been done by people in special education, people that have an interest in kids who struggle. And then, kind of interestingly, a lot of that work has helped to illuminate, it's helped us to better understand how typical students learn to read, like understanding the problems, kind of the areas of difficulty helps you also with understanding, what are typical students able to do that makes them successful in reading. There's, a line of research certainly in reading, in speech language, because speech language is very, very relevant to reading and reading problems. Learning to read is built on a base of oral language, and a lot of students who have reading difficulties have oral language, either like weaknesses that come out of not having had experience with language, or sometimes it's an actual disability that affects language, as in the case of dyslexia. So structured literacy, you can think of it as having kind of two parts. One part is the content. So there are certain abilities that structured literacy focuses on teaching, and they're the abilities that we know are important in learning to read. So skills like phonemic awareness, which is sensitivity to sounds in speech and being able to manipulate those sounds. Some specific reading abilities like knowing letter sounds is very important. Vocabulary, knowing word meanings. So structured literacy focuses on these abilities that are supported by evidence that, you know, they're important in learning to read. One of the controversies in the field has been you know, non-structured literacy approaches like 3 cueing systems, where you teach children to use maybe the first few letters of a word and a picture to kind of guess what the word might be. Those approaches are not well supported, because, you know, empirically, because that's not what good readers do. Good readers don't guess based on the pictures. The hallmark of good reading in the early grades is that the kids who become good readers are kids who are able to learn the code quickly, and whether that's English or Spanish or any other language, they learn that, you know, foundational aspect of reading with ease. And so they don't need to guess at words based on pictures, because they look at the letters and they can read that word already. So as you know, a colleague of mine once said, teaching children to guess based on context or based on pictures is like teaching a child to use crutches when you could teach them to walk, when they could learn to walk. So it's like teaching them to do what the poor readers do, not what the good readers do. Another example of a typical, you know, non-structured literacy type of activity are word shapes or word configuration cues, where students might get a word, you know, a series of boxes. So like a word like cat, you would have 2 short boxes and a tall box. And this students are supposed to write, you know, CA in the shorter boxes and the T in the tall box. And so you're kind of trying to sensitize them to the shape of the word. But that's not how good readers learn to read, because they pay attention to the alphabetic code. And in English or other alphabetic languages like Spanish, looking at the shapes of words is not very helpful, because the shape of cat could also be sat, or it could be sit. And so it's not useful, not a useful way to teach. So another big difference between structured literacy and non-structured literacy approaches has to do with the features, the instructional features of a program. So structured literacy prioritizes explicit teaching of important skills. So it's not feasible to teach students like every single thing we want them to know. And if students induce some skills on their own, that's all to the good, that's great. But in structured literacy, you don't count on that for students to learn the most important skills. Important skills are directly taught, like, you know, letter sounds and how to decode words, and important academic vocabulary, and, you know, that sort of thing. So in non-structured literacy approaches, there's often an emphasis on learning from exposure or learning from induction. So the teacher does not do a lot of direct teaching, or the method may just not lend itself to explicit teaching. So for example, some approaches, children would select their own books, their own projects, their own activities, and that it kind of sounds good, but the problem with that is it is then almost impossible for the teacher to teach explicitly, because if every student is doing a different thing, You can't, if everybody's reading a different book and doing a different thing, it doesn't mean you can't do some of that. But if that's the main focus of the program, then it's going to be impossible for the teacher to really teach explicitly. There's other features of structured literacy too. So besides explicit systematic teaching, one that's related to the idea of systematic teaching is prerequisite skills. So for example, in structured literacy, if you have a student who can't read a passage accurately, you wouldn't push them for speed. You wouldn't try to get them to read fast, because first they have to be able to read it accurately. Teachers in structured literacy pay attention to what are the most important prerequisites for learning certain skills. A couple of other features, this isn't an exhaustive list, but teachers give targeted feedback, the kind of feedback that helps students improve. So if students are reading a passage and making mistakes, even small mistakes like for the teacher would point to the word and have the student self-correct, or help them correct if they can't. Often with an error like for the, it's that the student's just not looking carefully. But we want them to look carefully, because that's how you become a good reader. That's something you have to do in the early stages of reading to become a good reader. It's just that good readers do it so automatically and quickly, it looks effortless. Also, there are lots of opportunities for students to respond. So in some classrooms, it might be mainly the good students, the good readers who do a lot of the responding. But in structured literacy, the teacher makes an effort to have all students respond, even students who are struggling. And that has a couple different functions. It helps all students get practice at whatever skill is being taught, but it also enables the teacher to see, who's having difficulty, who might need more attention, or maybe if a lot of students in a class are struggling with a certain skill, then the teacher needs to reteach it or teach it a different way, that kind of thing.
You mentioned at some point in your response being able to choose texts. In our conversations, you have mentioned to me that sometimes we really have to look at the motivation of a young reader
Right.
for the material that they're reading when we assess them, because sometimes they don't do a good job when they read, probably not because of the reading skill, but because they're reading something that doesn't interest them. If students choose their books for, these foundational skills, it's really not going to work for them necessarily, because the books are not designed for that either. So what is the role that you see in giving the students choice?
I agree. Definitely some choices are important with students who are at very beginning levels of reading, which are the kinds of students that might be reading, these very simple decodables. And I mean, I have to say about the decodables, when I used to teach a fieldwork program, as you know, and we had young students. And I mean, we had students sometimes in that program that, they would read like The Frog is on the Log, they read these very simple books. And we had kids say to us, this is the first book I ever read. Like, they'd be so excited. So with the younger ones, a lot of the time, they have not become too turned off yet. Mm-hmm. And they can be excited even by these very simple books, but some students are not, and it's very tough with the older. If you have older students functioning at very low reading levels, it's difficult. One thing the teacher can do is give students a choice of read alouds. So this would be more of a group level or class-wide level thing, but maybe the teacher is going to read a book and the students get input into what the read aloud book would be. Once kids are at like around a 2nd to 3rd grade reading level, even if they're much older, like even if they're in sixth grade, but they only read on a third grade level. There's a lot of books that are written for older students who read at lower levels that are meant to be engaging and motivating. And I think at that level, that's where you could try to really promote the students' own reading, help them find books that interest them, and do, one thing I've seen teachers do that I think could be really effective. One of my kids many years ago had a teacher who did this, and it was one of my all-time favorite activities. So the kids would have to read as part of their homework. I think this was fifth grade. And they would have to pick out several vocabulary words from whatever they were reading that they weren't sure of the meaning of, or they didn't know it. And they would have to write them down. They would write the context sentence, because using context to figure out what a word means is a good thing. Using context to guess at words and decoding is not something you want to encourage, but using it to figure out, what does the word bog mean or something like that, that's a good thing. So the kids would write the unknown word, the unknown vocabulary word, the context sentence. From the context sentence, they would take their best guess at the meaning of the word. And then they would look it up in the dictionary to see was their guess right or not. And so the reason I really like that activity is it's something you could apply to almost any text. It's got a lot of generalizability. It's encouraging kids to use context to figure out the meaning of the word. You're kind of incorporating dictionary skills. And it's not difficult for the teacher. It's not a huge production for the teacher, and yet it could be really beneficial for the student. It could be an online dictionary, or it could be something like a thesaurus, which I think is really useful to get words with similar meanings, where sometimes that's more useful even than a dictionary definition. Right. Or another online resource I've seen kids use for word meanings is Google Images. So they enter the word and then a bunch of images pop up, and that can sometimes be helpful especially for kids who have really limited reading skills.
And I think that's a good idea for teachers too, when they're teaching words.
Right, that's
they
right.
Provide the image for students. And it makes me think about deaf multilingual learners. That could also be a great resource for teachers of the deaf, because
yes,
students are going to have the challenges that we know, their
right.
sound-based reading strategies are not necessarily going to work for all of them.